Hi there. Welcome to Compassion in a T-shirt. I'm Dr. Stan Steindl. Here we'll talk about all things compassion and self-compassion and how to cultivate a compassionate world. We'll discuss compassion in healthcare, compassion in education, compassion in workplaces, as well as something of a focus on compassion in mental health and psychological well-being. Today's episode is episode 1 of Compassion in a T-shirt as a podcast. And to celebrate, as well as acknowledging what's gone before and the transition to something new, I have the great pleasure of welcoming Associate Professor James Kirby to the show. James, of course, is a researcher of high repute. He has an extensive list of publications, as well as many projects on the go. He's also a clinician and a speaker and author, having recently published his first book, Choose Compassion. I interviewed James some time ago about Choose Compassion, and so you can go and check out that interview here. He's also one of the co-authors of Essentials in Compassion-Focused Therapy, a practice manual for clinicians, along with Nikki Petrocchi and Beatrice Baldi, who've both been interviewed before on Compassion in a T-shirt. But James and I have also been co-hosts of the Compassion Initiative podcast. We created this podcast several years ago, and it's been quite well received. On there, we had conversations with each other, we interviewed others, and we uploaded various practices and exercises. And so while there's excitement for my new podcast, Compassion in a T-shirt, there's a little bit of sadness letting go of the Compassion Initiative podcast. Having said that, James will be continuing things over there under the new name Compassionate Mind Research Group podcast. So all of those resources will still be available. In our conversation today, James and I will talk about some interesting recent research findings in the science of compassion, some projects that James himself has on the go, and then we'll reflect on the Compassion Initiative podcast. It's a fun conversation. James comes along with his unique blend of wisdom and mischief. And so I bring you Associate Professor James Kirby. All right. Well, Associate Professor James Kirby, welcome back to Compassion in a T-shirt.
Oh, sorry, Stan. I'm just busy reading something at the moment. If you could just give me a moment. Geez, this is a good read. Sorry about that. Yeah, what was that, Stan? Sorry. What were you saying?
Very good. Welcome, my man, back to Compassion in a T-shirt. I think we talked, I don't know when it was, but last time it was about your book, the wonderful book, Choose Compassion.
I haven't got a coffee here.
I can see it.
No,
I can see the cover is framed up in above your right shoulder.
that's right. No, that was, how long ago was that? That's probably over a year then.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's a long time between convos.
And for anyone watching, I'll link that video in the description.
Thanks, Stan.
James, I'm interested first of all just to hear like what's happening in the science of compassion. Like, what are some things some latest findings out there, that are kind of I don't know, interesting to you, or sort of big results that have come out, or interesting findings. What's the research uncovered recently?
Yeah, God, yeah, I mean, that's hard. There's some cracking work being done by people all over the world. Things that are kind of grabbing my interest probably, is some stuff kind of trying to focus more in on, the targets of our compassionate actions. So like a lot of the work we do rely on, those self-report questionnaires, which are fantastic, but they're often not like target specific. It's kind of like, generally I try to be compassionate towards others, perhaps, but others is kind of a very vague notion. Like, who are these others that we speak of? Are they family? Are they your kids? Are they someone you dislike? Whoever it might be. Um, Other sentient creatures, so those kinds of things interest me in the research when the target's more clear. And, there's been some recent studies looking at how a compassion intervention, when compared to active controls, which were language active controls, actually, which is really cool. And they found that a compassion intervention increased feelings towards known disliked targets. So I really like that. Olga Klemecki was part of that research, and I've forgotten the other researchers involved, but I want to say it's Costello or something like that. But I know I've got that wrong. But if you just type in published in scientific reports, compassion towards disliked others, a disliked target, that was cool. Because
Mm.
compassion for those we love is easy, as the Dalai Lama says, but compassion for those that we dislike or who are enemies, that's when we need compassion the most, particularly in, I think, today's current climate, where there is a lot of othering, a lot of me versus you on some important kind of, dare I say, political dimensions. So how do we extend beyond that and still connect to this other sentient creature who, much like you, is trying their best in the world and stuff like that? So I think that is really cool. And
Mm.
so that's stuff we've been trying to do too in our labs. So, we've got some work going on at the moment funded by, the Mind and Life Institute, looking at, can a compassion compared to breathing intervention help at increasing your willingness to act compassionately towards those who you know and dislike. So we're trying to do a bit more work in that space, I suppose, getting to know, you know, towards a certain target that you're really wanting to foster more towards, that kind of compassion, pro-sociality towards. Can we do it?
Mm. Would you say that liking is a facilitator of compassion and disliking is an inhibitor of compassion? Is that kind of one way to break that down sometimes?
Absolutely. So, I mean, one study we did looked at likability, and we found when it comes to sort of kindness, so doing things that are kind of, favors, gestures, things of, generosity, we find that likability really diminishes willingness to either do kind acts or not. If you like them, absolutely no drama. With compassion, it drops it, but not to the same degree. So, and in some emerging data we've got coming out looking at factors that predict your willingness to act compassionately. So these are experience sampling studies we do. So people on their phone will get pinged, 7 times during the day across a week, and asking them, have they acted compassionately or not, and if they have, who was the target. Now, with that target, we don't ask who the target is specifically, but we ask on a dimension from stranger to someone very close. And then we also ask about, how much do you like this person? And what we found was closeness predicts willingness to act, or actually acting, I should say. But likability didn't. It
Mm.
wasn't associated. So I think there are different ways to measure. Experience sampling is one that we think is kind of, uniquely placed to capture some really important information about compassion and interactions that other self-report measures don't quite capture. But on a self-report kind of typical study, we find likability impacts, but, and can predict, but certainly not in this study. So
Mm.
that's
Yes,
pretty cool.
it's very curious. How often are people being compassionate? Um, who are they being compassionate towards? How close to that person are they? How much do they like them? There's a lot to it, isn't there, in terms of, kind of what might sort of predict the compassionate action.
Mm.
Do you notice whether there's any kind of like, is liking someone or loving someone sometimes a double-edged sword? I mean, I know that it can feel easier to be motivated to be compassionate to someone that you like or love, but I suspect it could be sometimes, complicated too.
Are you talking about our relationship or?
I love you a lot, but sometimes it's hard.
Um, Absolutely. Yeah, I think you've hammered on a really important point here. Sometimes with closeness, in that dimension of closeness we're using, we're not asking very close to you, are they a family member? Uh, we're asking people, just are they really close to you or not? And some people will interpret that closeness in ways that are favorable for them, people they, really love and care for a great deal. But if we made it more specific, which would be better, and if it was family, there'd be certainly some people who would say there's not anything in the world that could compel me to do something compassionate for that person. You have no idea what they put me through, because maybe they
Mm.
came from a family of, where there was a lot of child maltreatment or neglect or something like that. So that's a really critical one. You can't choose your family, all right?
Mm.
It's the family you've got. And as a result, that can make it tricky. One of the things you've got, though, with family, because there's that, shared genetic element, is there's a great temporal aspect to it. So, you might not get along with your sibling, but your sibling is the person you'll spend the longest amount of time on this earth with. Out of any other relationship, that's the one you'll be on the planet with the longest, that sibling, and shared that life. So despite there can be massive hiccups at times during that very long relationship, there might be opportunities because of the connection of genetic shared history, of trying to reach out more to that person than what it would otherwise be if it wasn't someone in the family. I don't know if I made any sense there.
Mm. No, there's sort of, I guess the more specificity, the more, the richer it becomes. We understand it more and more. There's kind of closeness, there's likability, there's familial or genetic relationships. There's sort of a range of things that combine together and kind of help to, I guess, predict to a degree compassionate action. I was kind of coming at it too from a slightly the opposite, which is that, sometimes if we feel close or we like or love somebody, that sometimes that might motivate us towards compassion, but towards what unwise action. For example, we might start to be more inclined to kind of tell them what to do, and then they kind of
Oh,
resist
right.
us, or something like that. Or we might feel for them, and so we try to take away their suffering, but we do so by we end up taking away their independence, in the same way that sometimes if there's skin in the game, we're more compassionate, but the action is trickier, and so on.
Oh, completely. You know, that's always a tricky one. If you think of parenting at times, hey, when do I let my child go here and feel the pain of whatever it is that they're doing? Or do I come in here and try to guide in ways that will avoid the mistake or error, but then they might lose that really important kind of organic, natural learning experience that they would otherwise go through. So that's always kind of a tricky one. And I think that's one of the difficulties, with compassion. Like, I think it's just an ongoing process. There is no end point to it. It's ongoing. You always look at getting feedback and reflecting on that. So you try, and you might be too involved to begin with, but that's not the end of it. That doesn't mean you can't change and be flexible. So it's kind of reflecting with that self-awareness. Maybe even getting their input, or asking someone else in a parenting situation. Might ask your partner, hey, I think I may have overstepped there. What do you think? Or, I know he really wants to go out and do the skateboarding, but I'm afraid he's gonna break an arm. And it's like, yeah, but that's what he loves. You gotta
Mm.
let him do it. And
Mm.
so some of those things are a kind of sometimes trial and error kind of process, but yeah, sometimes too much in our research, we make it black and white, but there's just so much gray. And
Mm.
that temporal element, sometimes I think the real kind of deep compassion is when you've noticed it, despite the fact that there are some issues, you try to overcome that, offer something, it's not received in the way it was intended. There's been some kind of blow up, but then moments pass and there's a try again from one party. It could be the person comes back and say, hey, sorry, I just wasn't in the headspace and I perhaps took that too much of a personal kind of, interference. Or the other person coming back and saying, hey, you know, really sorry about, what I said there, I didn't mean to, etc. And then that is kind of like something which that's like a after the process kind of has occurred, coming back to. But I think that's really powerful, the coming back to. And I think
Mm.
compassion is really important. I think we all know that in clinical work, how important that element is, the returning to. but it's really hard to capture in research design.
Mm. Dare I say, maybe there are three psychologies or processes of compassion. There's the sensitivity to suffering in self and others. There's the commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. And then there's the review, reflection, refinement, in that more temporal sense, because we're not likely to get it perfectly right, the first time or every time. And there might be, we want to be able to have a sense of how our compassionate action is received, I guess, and then kind of adjust accordingly.
Oh, 100%, and that part is, I think where a lot of the cool juiciness is, personally, but it's tricky to find because, when you start doing these things and you're trying to be more compassionate towards people, it can feel great. You kind of feel like you're contributing, making a difference. Uh, but our work hasn't really focused on, but what if it's been kind of rejected or blocked, or it hasn't gone the way it's intended? What happens to you then? Like, how do you then work with all this energy you've now got? You've got this, your self-report scores say you're much more compassionate towards others. You've got it and you want to show it and express it, but how do we express it in ways that work for different groups and individuals? And if we get bad feedback, what do you do with that?
Mm. I think you've just given me the thumbnail for today's video. Compassion is juicy. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's sticky. You've got it all over you. You can't.
oh, no, enough. But no, I
I
do
think,
agree. I think that it really gets very interesting when we start to bring context in, when we start to bring time or the temporal nature of it in, when we start to see it as an ongoing, unfolding, kind of gradually evolving, even kind of process and learning. And it's got the engagement, it's got the action, it's got the self and the other. There's a lot going on there to determine whether it actually kind of works. So that's sort of a bit of an area. Can you give us a snapshot? What are some of the other key areas you're working in? Like sort of, is that a difficult question? What would you say there?
yeah. I mean, there's just all of it fascinates us. But I guess one area where we're putting a lot of energy into at the moment is this idea of single session interventions. And so that's this idea that, you know, people who want to seek, say, an intervention out, or like a compassion program out, or even seek a therapist out, perhaps, they can. But on average, the number of sessions they might get in terms of contact is around, moving close to four. But those four sessions aren't really structured in a specific way, so that, okay, this is what we plan to cover in four sessions. We're going to get through this. Really, the four sessions are more of a getting to know each other, maybe a bit of assessment, and they don't happen week after week. There can be like big spaces or even a couple of days between some of those sessions. So they're not really structured on purpose deliberately like that. Whereas single session interventions tries to take this idea that the average number of sessions people get is not a lot. The vast majority of people who want help don't get it, for starters. And then thirdly, the mode number of sessions is one, typically. So if you went with that mindset that you only had one chance to have impact and it was only 30 minutes, what would you try to convey? And so that is what we've been doing, thinking about, if you think of compassion, what would we want to convey in only 30 minutes to try to make something stick? So, sometimes I refer to this, and I'm doing some of this work in uh, schools with teachers and students, is how do we make it count and carry? So how can we make it count, that point of 30 minutes, but how do we make it carry beyond that short term, the next day, and hopefully let it carry forward into, the next month, the next year, to have it a real shift in one's kind of perspective and trajectory. So I like single session interventions. They're not to replace ongoing therapy or anything like that. But there are just, not everyone needs long therapy to begin with. But also, secondly, the idea of single session interventions is you access it when you need it. And so the idea is this is uh, communicated through networks. And so, it's on TikToks, it's on Instagrams, it's on. So you just see a part of it, and then if you see it, you can click it and access it and do it. No one's telling you you must do this. And for some groups, particularly teenagers, that's a real source of agency.
Mm.
Uh, and yeah, I think, to ask you a question, Stan, like what would you put in a 30-minute single session intervention trying to stir compassion?
Yeah, well, done. That was my next question for you. I was thinking is it to have a compassionate conversation? Is it to do some sort of psychoeducation? And there's a sort of something there that's kind of like needs to know, or is it a skills kind of period? Like I suppose those are the three things that occur to me. I mean, I think my CFT and motivational interviewing mind would say a compassionate conversation would be my leaning, but I'm curious to hear what you're thinking.
Oh, well, I mean, in this literature, Jessica Schleider does so much work at Northeastern, and she uh, puts forward this idea of a best framework. And so the 30-minute intervention should include something to do with brain science, which would be psychoed. Uh, Secondly, empowerment. And so all of these single session interventions would start by saying something like, we need your help, or tell us what we need to know about this area that you're having whatever difficulty with. So there's an empowerment process. The S stands for saying is believing. So if you taught a skill within the single session, the question would then be posed to you. So if you had someone you really cared about who was going through what you were going through, how would you tell them what you've just learned so that they could use it? And so it's kind of like building on that kind of learning and memory research that shows if you can teach it to someone else, you've embedded it, the principles much better. And then T is testimonials. So that's within the single session intervention. People like you of your age or whatever it might be, depending on who the SSI is targeted towards, write in, I also, struggled with this at an X, Y, and Z, and that's included within it. Now, it doesn't have to go linear like that in the SSI, but it's just making sure that the SSI is developed such as those processes are sprinkled throughout. And so for us, like we've identified like three circles as being really important. So we want to include a little bit on that, a bit of psychoed. Um, and then we kind of look at, okay, what things are useful in kind of stimulating a bit of a compassionate mind. So then we were kind of thinking, well, you know, tone of voice, inner tone, stuff like that, it can be really helpful. So, using that kind of stuff. Um, and then having some testimonials in there to help with the de-shaming element of it. It's not your fault. Those kinds of messages we see as being pretty important from a CFT perspective. So we kind of include it, but it depends on the population. Like at first, we're targeting teens with difficulties. So we're kind of calling it self-compassion for difficult emotions for teens. So that's what we're kind of targeting there. We're equally doing one similarly for adults. But, what you might develop for a different population, um, uh, you know, say another one could be, caregivers of a partner with dementia. What we might choose to focus on there might be different.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, no, very cool. That's sort of fascinating to imagine what would be the biggest bang for your buck type thing in a half an hour. It's not a lot of time, is it? But there might be a way to provide a little bit of kind of, understanding of the evolutionary kind of part to it, the theory there
Yeah.
behind it, a little bit of some certain sort of body-based skills or some of the tone related kind of stuff, being empowering and evocative and also the testimonials, which actually for me, I guess for you, you're thinking in terms of that message of it's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And I guess also testimonials help with self-efficacy, that kind of vicarious learning in a sense that the person sort of feels like, oh, well, if someone like me can do it, then maybe I can do it too, type of a thing. And so that might help there as well.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, drawing upon a bit of motivational interviewing element of it too, you know, we're not kind of trying to persuade the person to do it. So the way we get participants is by putting it out there in social media context where people can click on it and do it when they want to do it. So that kind of, I want to do this, that kind of desire is the driving force, as opposed to us coming into a, a group and saying, hey, are you eligible or not for this study? This is what we're doing with, and paying you to be involved or whatever it might be. So it's kind of reversing it, going, we're going to put it out there. Anyone can access it whenever they want. There's no involvement at all with a therapist or anything like that. Although you can do single session therapist interventions as well. That would be something different. That would be interesting to think about. But yeah, that element I think is really cool. And then the beginning of all these SSIs kind of talks about, this takes 30 minutes. Only do this if you feel like you can do this right now. So like, are you committed to doing this for 30 minutes? So there's a commitment question asked right at the beginning. And if you say, no, I'm not committed, well, don't bother. They can still go through if they want to, but that's a critical question to,
Right.
we want people who are committed to do it now. That's when we know you're committed to doing an SSI.
Yeah.
So there's some really nice obviously overlaps there.
Yeah, that's really that's some great stuff. Who's compassion and who the target is, compassion in a kind of single session kind of arrangement. The other area that I've been particularly curious about lately, and I know you have as well, and sort of doing some work in the area, is men and compassion. I guess I was wondering about that, and like what have you found in your reading or research, in terms of men and compassion or self-compassion, how they experience that or express it? Are there certain kind of strengths that men kind of demonstrate there in compassion and self-compassion, or ways that they do it, or are there certain challenges, I guess, that you've observed? What would you say about all that?
Yeah, yes, all the above. I don't know. There's just not a lot of good qualitative studies done with men about their views on compassion, how they see compassion. There's certainly lots of people who have run compassion or different types of compassion-based programs with men, like people like Daniel Ellenberg, for example. He's run stacks of uh, interventions and programs specifically for men, and now really focusing in on compassion with men with Steve Hickman. And the Global Compassion Coalition has a whole men's boys compassion initiative, which is a real focus. And there's a lot of materials available free on the Global Compassion Coalition website around that. In fact, Daniel organized like a conference. It's all up there, 4 hours of speaking to like 20 different researchers about this kind of notion of compassion and men. There's some terrific stuff up there. So I do highly recommend checking that out. But yeah, I do think obviously the field of compassion, the kind of empirical field is the data relies heavily on female participants as opposed to male. Like in our meta-analysis, Dan, there was only 15% of the data was from men. But that was back in 2017. A lot has happened in that space since. For example, the group in Portugal, Daniel Rio, De Souza, and so on, they're just focused on boys, teenage boys, with over 100 in those studies of just boys. And these are boys in detention centers, So, I mean, that blows your socks off in some ways. Like there is some really wonderful stuff being done. And, their randomized control trial published in Journal Consolidating Clinical Psychology, looking at their psychopathy.com program with these male teens is extraordinary. Like the change that they got, it's inspiring. So there is stuff done with boys, with men, not so much. But I mean, I've kind of done some research empirically with self-report scales, but I've not kind of qualitative. I'd love to do more of a qualitative study looking at how do we get this engagement of men. I was talking to an elite ice hockey player, would you believe, at the recent Mind and Life Summer Research Institute. And he's really keen to bring his name's Cedric, and he's really keen to bring self-compassion into that sports setting. And we started talking about how he was like, should we call it the program self-compassion, or should we call it he had a really cool name for him, like strength and enhance or something like that, like a play on words, but it was had enhance in it. And I'm like, well, if I had an option, I'd choose the strength and enhance program, because that just sounds a little cooler than self-compassion. Um,
Yeah.
so, there is a lot of people writing about, do you call it self-compassion in the title, or do you call it something different?
Hmm.
I don't know. I think you're fine to call it something different, but at least let people know that what you'll be doing is focusing on sort of compassion, I suppose. But
Hmm.
there
Yes, I
are
guess.
different ways to appeal to boys and men.
Yeah, Russell Colts calls his program True Strength, I think, doesn't he? And
Yeah,
he's worked primarily with men who are sometimes incarcerated and experiencing anger. And so his as you know very well, his program True Strength is CFT for anger. I actually, yeah, your recent paper, I can't remember the full title, but you were looking at masculinity and predicting mental health, and you were exploring some, I guess, moderators would it have been? I get the statistical terms confused, but insecure striving, social safeness, fears of compassion, that there were sort of interesting relationships there in terms of masculine norms and mental health outcomes and these intervening kind of variables. Can you give us a snapshot of what you
yeah.
found in that correlational study?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's an important point actually. Yeah, so it's a correlational, cross-sectional kind of design. So you'd want to, you kind of have to hold this um, a little, lightly. We need more longitudinal studies and experimental studies. But in that kind of research, we were looking at this kind of idea embedded in this theory called the precarious manhood, which is kind of like this idea that manhood is something which is socially earned. So, you just can't say, I'm a tough man or I'm a real man. That's kind of validated or endorsed by your community or the social groups you keep. And so you have to do really tough things or really strange, weird tough men things to show that you can cop it and or tolerate it. So like you see this a lot, like in sporting groups, you have the tough pre-season, can you get through it? Are you really one of us? You have this in fraternities sometimes in college, you have to go through this ritual or whatever it is to really be one of us. And so to earn that mantle of being a man, particularly when you look at it in that kind of traditional masculinity way, in which you kind of mentioned, you have to do these kind of stoic, kind of tough, uh, kind of what's the what kind of almost playboyish way you kind of hold yourself in the world to be seen as being someone who is a man. So it takes a lot of effort, always in social settings. And then once it's earned, though, you can easily lose it by one wrong move. If you say something that seems a little, um, you know, uh, paradoxical to manhood, you're in trouble and you'll be kind of, belittled and shamed for that. So, oh, you're weak, you're a loser, whatever it might be, very quickly. So, and when that happens, the man overcompensates. And so there's been some terrific studies done on this where, you're in the lab, a man's told you're in the bottom 10% of testosterone, so they're given this false feedback. Like we've just taken earlier, you're in the bottom 10%. Then they get put in a driving simulation, and those that get told they're in the bottom 10% always drive more aggressively, take more risks in the simulation to those who are told they're in the top 10% or just in the average range. So men tend to overcompensate when their masculinity is challenged to restore that social manhood validation. So what we were interested in is, well, there's a lot of insecure striving there from a CFT perspective, and then they mustn't feel very socially safe. And so if you're a man who feels socially unsafe, and you're trying to strive and earn praise amongst your peers, that kind of traditional masculine um, kind of archetype is a clear one that's provided time and time again. Just have to throw a movie on. It's a tough guy, Arnie, Sylvester Stallone, or you know, uh, look at the political figures who have power. They are all kind of at the moment kind of brilliant illustrations of this toxic masculinity, hegemonic masculinity kind of a construct. So it can work for you if you get the power. And so it's a trade-off though, because not everyone does, and then that leads to lots of anxiety and depression. So and fears of compassion play into that too, because you can't let people in, because if you open your vulnerability and let people in, you're no longer a stoic, tough man. Like the biggest subscales of that construct, traditional masculinity, that causes difficulties is trying to have too much emotional control. So they really try to suppress it and not show any vulnerability whatsoever. And of course, that's a nightmare for mental health.
Mm. And the construct in fears of compassion is fears of receiving compassion, I think, came out kind of on top, closely followed by fears of self-compassion.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
So it's
I
a
was on
tricky
a
one. How much of that is the individual man's fault, or how much of that is the fact that we've got these social cultural norms that have been here for a long time now? And men will say this when they transition into fatherhood, they feel the gender norm stress pressures coming on immediately. You can see this with, antenatal and prenatal parental classes. As a man, they'll often, say, like, I feel like I'm an outsider, I'm in the way, I haven't gone through all of that pain and stress of what can be traumatic birthings and stuff. And so as a result, there's like, well, there's not much I can do, and there isn't much service available for me either. Like, there's not a lot of things there for the man in those settings to kind of feel, what can I do, or what would be of value? So there's not much offered to them either. And so then that kind of puts this gender norm stress and strain on them. And so they go, well, I'll go out and earn the money. I'll be the protector, be the provider, which is again like a classic kind of gender Western archetype that they'll try to endorse. But our society is also one which doesn't give much parental leave. So there isn't a chance for the father really to be that involved either, in those early stages. It's not to say it's great for mums. It's not good for mums either. That's important to recognize. But there can be this sense of, I'm kind of in the way. And if I do try to get involved, I'm causing, more annoyance than goodness. So I'll just get back to what I'm supposed to do.
Mm. Yeah, no, I think it is. It's interesting to just sort of zoom in on men a little bit and sort of see. I mean, there's definitely a whole range of kind of considerations for women as well, and across the genders, and that's certainly really very, very important. But yeah, when we zoom in on men, it is interesting, isn't it? There are intrapersonal and interpersonal and societal and historical kind of factors that all kind of send them down this road a little bit, and we all feel it. Even compassionistas like you and I was on the Zoom with a fellow I admire earlier this morning, and I've got the surfing picture in the back, and he was like, "Oh, do you surf?" And I was like, "Yeah, yeah." And he was like, and he was like, "You surfing at the moment?" And I was like, "Oh no, it's a bit too cold at the moment." And he was like, "Oh, okay, all right, I see." I'm like, oh, I was like up in the social rank, and then I was back down and sort of thing.
Yeah.
And that
Weak,
little
you're weak.
interactions like that. What's that, mate?
Exactly. Yeah, you're weak. You're weak. Why aren't you in the surf?
Yeah.
And then people will throw a gender derogatory term at you.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's
I
terrible.
didn't cop that today, but absolutely. I mean, this particular person was from Melbourne, where it's much colder than where I am, so I think he felt that was all a bit funny.
But I
Well,
felt that too,
James,
actually. I had a friend from Exeter who was here, and that's in England. And I took them to the beach, and it was 21 degrees, the water. And she's like, "You're hopping in." I said, "No, too cold for me." She's like, "What? This is gorgeous." I was like, "No, off you go." If it was a man who was saying that to me, I probably would have gone, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, you're right. Okay, I'll jump in." So I kind
bit of,
of do, yeah, a bit of that plays in and, you know,
yeah,
triggers my stupidity.
yeah. Well, it's not our fault, James. But it is our responsibility somewhat. And at this point, I was just going to shift gears a little bit. I mean, you've just got so much research, many fingers in many pies across from kind of treatment studies to the neuroscience and brain studies through to the the kind of the culture and masculinity and other elements there, and it's just phenomenal. A lot of the stuff that you've mentioned, I'll try to kind of get various links so that people can have a look at some of the things you alluded to and so on. But the other purpose of chatting to you today really was to mark a bit of a transition for us, because you and I have long co-hosted the Compassion Initiative podcast. And I don't know if this is too strong to say it. It's sort of suddenly I'm feeling emotional, but that at least that little collaboration is about to come to an end. I've decided to spin off Compassion in a T-shirt, the YouTube channel, into a podcast of its own, and that hasn't quite been set up yet. Although I'm hoping that this conversation will be the launch conversation, along with Paul Gilbert that I've interviewed recently as well. Actually, I must admit, I went to have a look at Compassion Initiative today, and I see that you've already moved on and renamed it Compassionate Mind Research Group podcast. So congratulations. Obviously, you feel quite comfortable with the whole thing, and you have. So if anyone's interested, the Compassion Initiative podcast is now called the Compassionate Mind Research Group podcast. But yeah, like reflecting on the Compassion Initiative, I mean, what sort of moments stand out for you, or what memories do you have of our time together?
Yeah, very fond memories. And part of it is sad we haven't been able to have the regular kind of conversations that we were having there at the beginning, because they were great. Like, we still have regular conversation, we just don't tend to record them.
That's true.
And then it's just, you know, the structure and scheduling gets tricky at times. But you've also just been bloody killing it with the amazing range of interviews you've done with clinicians across the world and researchers across the world over the last couple of years. It's just been amazing. And the old Compassion Initiative podcast was really relying a lot on the only content really coming out were those interviews you were doing, Stan. So it kind of hasn't really been there. I mean, if I reflect back, I can't even remember our last conversation in that Compassion Initiative, just two guys having a chat about compassion. It's probably back pre-COVID even.
Yeah, that was. I think COVID was a real kind of hard stop for lots of things, wasn't it? But I think it contributed there. But yeah, the Compassion Initiative podcast has continued to host lots of sort of practices from you. There's many practices on there, and they are some of the most listened to things on Compassion Initiative. Some of your soothing rhythm breathing and calm place imagery and compassionate self and compassionate other, compassionate self. They're the big ones. And some of I was traditionally putting up some of my episodes and interviews as well. But I remember interviewing Paul Gilbert many years ago, and that you and me and Paul sitting there in your little office at the University of Queensland, and there were various outtakes and bloopers that I think you shared a blooper actually on YouTube from that
Yeah.
time. He was coming to present Compassion for the Dark Side, I think was the name of that particular presentation at UQ. So that one's a real standout for me. I enjoyed that
Yeah.
particular conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a beaut. I don't know. I think the ones that stand out for me were the early ones where we were just finding our way. I mean, we were so raw and new to kind of this science, and we were also raw and new to the whole idea of a podcast, and that's kind of been evolving a lot since, and you've kind of been crafting that art so amazingly over the years. But if you go back, it's just two of us in like a dungeon somewhere at the university in a little office, or so I remember going out to your practice a couple of times and sitting there having
Mm.
those conversations. And it wasn't so much about what we talked about. It wasn't so much the content. It was just more about uh, the relationship for me. It was that was the memories that kind of stand out. It was about, us both being kind of vulnerable with what we knew, and I think we tried to include that a little bit in the in the subtitle of your or description. Just two guys in
Yeah.
Brisbane, um, because we were just kind of stumbling our ways into it, trying to get a
Mm.
better grasp of what the heck this is about, but just knowing this is something really cool and being able to do it together, I think was a great source of reassurance and encouragement. So
Yeah.
that was the thing that it was most important for me, I think, from those
Yeah.
compassion moments.
Yeah, me too. Was it 2014, the original Paul Gilbert kind of introduction to CFT that we attended, I think, and then we developed the UQ Compassion Symposium, of course, which has kind of continued on and gone from strength to strength. And the podcast was, yeah, just coming from a real place of enthusiasm and joy and discovery and kind of and also comradeship and kind of there was a lot of soothing affiliative system, I think, at play, as much as there was also probably drive system and maybe
Oh,
even a bit of threat,
100%.
who knows,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
but there was a real sense of connection and kind of from that secure base exploring this topic that we have both become so fascinated by and interested in and you've certainly contributed an enormous amount from just the research and training point of view. So, but like kind of as we do the transition, I mean, what are your thoughts? Like, do you have any sort of advice for me? Like, how would you sort of what would you recommend in terms of how I proceed? And
Oh, mate, don't hold back. Just keep doing what you're doing. It's unbelievable. Like, I mean, just the. I think there are so many voices in this compassion space doing really great work, and you're able to find people who I've been desperate to hear from that I haven't heard from really, but you managed to charm them into agreeing to do a podcast, and it's just been fantastic hearing all of the different perspectives, particularly for me, the kind of clinical perspectives of how people have used compassion in different ways in therapy. I've really loved that and take notes on that, but. I just think you've got I guess, I mean, who am I to give advice? But you know, you're
but you
so
will.
nice. Yeah, yeah, you're so nice. You should come in with a little bit of you've got your whole vibe. Your whole beautiful person that you are, that everyone gravitates towards. But maybe you should have like a, maybe what should we call it? Getting serious with Stan, 3 minutes of, okay, I'm just going to hit you with a tough question here, which you might not like, and it might be kind of juxtaposed to who I am or be seen as, but here's a tough one. Here's a curly for you. That so maybe it's almost like a persona you take on. You're hopping into the what do you call it? The devil's advocate or something like that kind of position.
Ah,
Just to kind of, because it's tricky though. A lot of people are very generous with giving up time and talking. And my God, hopping on a podcast where you're kind of drilled for what it is you're doing, it's not very enjoyable. It's
yeah.
not very pleasant, and it's just crap, really, for the for the person. But I don't know. Have you ever thought much about that at all?
I like that idea. Actually, it's got me thinking. I have been doing fun and quirky questions. Like if what would your compassionate superpower be, or what compassionate person would you like to have dinner with? But maybe I could add a sort of a serious stand section where I might I might say to you, but James, isn't sometimes compassion can be toxic? What do
Yeah,
you say to that, or
yeah,
something?
exactly. Yeah,
And I could, I do want people to have a nice time, and obviously I want to promote their work and for them
yeah,
to feel
absolutely.
happy and confident having had the conversation. But I could always, include that in some of the prior correspondence, like how would they
Yeah,
feel about this kind of question or that, just as it's kind of half, it's a serious thing, but it's like a fun thing, serious Stan, and I'm going to ask you this harder question. So I think I like it. I
maybe
think
give
that's
it
good.
about like James, you found this in your research, but no one else can find it. What's going on there?
Mm,
Something like that or something. I mean, one person who I've heard do this a little bit quite well is Scott Barry Kaufman in his
yes.
psychology pod. He's got this real quirky, enjoyable, exuberant kind of bubbliness to him, effervescent like yourself. But sometimes it'll be like, I don't know if I agree with that. He says his kind of thing, but it's never said in an aggressive way or humiliative, kind of, expressive, kind of, demeaning. He's always like, I know you've kind of, this is might be, frames it in such a way that makes it
Yeah.
feel like it's just genuine conversation, really.
Yes.
And you and I have those conversations all of the time, like
Yes.
pushing each other on different areas and topics, and I don't know if I agree with that and stuff like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, yeah. No, I think that's good. Just a fun little anecdote. I agree. Barry Kaufman is very good at that, and he has this little chuckle, doesn't he, that he often does when he sort of to soften it and so on. But he's a very smart guy, and all across all sorts of research and so on. But the fun anecdote is I every now and then I reach, high for my interview guests, and I sort of write different people, and yes, often I don't hear back from them because they're a bit too busy and whatever. But Scott was one who wrote back and said, "Nah, given what I've got on, I'm too busy. I can't be on your podcast." But I actually saw that as fantastic, that there he is, Scott, like he's like the longest serving psychology podcaster, most successful. And even the fact that he took the time to send me a declining email, I thought that I was pretty chuffed even by that.
No, but it just speaks to his kind of sort of, I think, his integrity and respect for people. Like,
Absolutely.
he's one of these guys that will do that. And that, better hearing back and they've seen you've been heard, you've been responded to, and we just respect each other. Yeah, it's crazy busy. And at this point, no, but that doesn't mean it's not a no forever. Like, who knows what might eventuate in the future. But yeah, it's just, he had the time to be able to respond. I think that's fantastic. But
Yeah.
would have been great to have a podcast though, wouldn't it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, you introduced me to him and his podcast many years ago. You were an early adopter, I think, of the psychology podcast.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he's been generous in many ways. Like he wrote an endorsement for my book as well. And
Yeah.
we've had correspondence across the years and should reach out again. But he just goes higher and higher. Like, I think he was on Oprah's show once and
Yeah.
some of the stuff he's doing is another stratosphere.
Yes. Yeah. Well, mate, thank you very much for all that you do in the world of work and research and teaching and training, and thank you for being such a dear friend and a very inspiring colleague. I appreciate all that you are and do, and thank you for being willing to talk again on compassion in a t-shirt.
Mate, absolutely thrilled. I got to ask you one more question though before you depart. What do
Okay.
you see the vision being for compassion in a t-shirt? Where do you see it going? I mean, it's been something you've been working away at for a while now, and this has obviously been percolating under the surface, so to speak. Where do you see it sort of going over the next short term, anyway?
Well, I'm committed to weekly videos, and
Okay.
I'm trying to see whether consistent, frequent videos, kind of help with viewership and subscribers. Things have been steadily improving in that area, so I think but really the vision of the whole thing is the science and practice of compassion in plain language. You know, that's the in a t-shirt thing, I guess, is that it's just trying to really convey to and disseminate to as many people as possible this thing that we call compassion. You know, what it is and how to do it, and what are the blocks and how to work through them, and just trying to, it sounds a bit lofty, but just making a more compassionate world really is the idea. And then I might, I'm thinking of adding a shop to sell t-shirts. Then there's that bit.
That's awesome. Yeah, got to have the merch. I would definitely be buying a t-shirt.
All
So
right, buddy.
with that though, then with the weekly committed videos that you're doing and stuff, do you ever fear not finding someone, or like how many people can I interview, or is that just something that doesn't enter the mindset?
Well, I have in my mind that I do the sort of the interview format, and I do what I call a sort of a video essay format. So the video essay is when I'm just more talking to camera and sort of describing certain things or reviewing a paper or doing a practice or things like that. So I kind of feel like I have that as backup if it needed to be. But having said that, yeah, at the moment I'm well and truly in advance. I mean, this particular conversation probably won't come out until August, and well, that's only a couple of weeks away, I think. But I've got about 5 weeks, lined up ahead, and if anyone out there would like to be on Compassion in a T-shirt, let me know. By all means, make a comment or send me an email. But yeah, no, I think there's so many great people that really I would love to give a voice to and to kind of promote whatever it is that they might be doing.
Amazing.
Good on you, mate. Thank you very much.
Pleasure.